To the real mother in this family, Ashley Whitmore said, lifting her glass at the center of Margaret Whitmore's own dining table, smiling as if the house, the dinner, and even the day itself belonged to her. Margaret Whitmore was 72 years old, and for more than 4 decades she had hosted Mother's Day dinner in the same colonial house on Maple Ridge Drive, the white 2-story home her late husband had bought when their son Daniel was still learning how to ride a bicycle in the driveway. Every year the routine was the same. Margaret would wake up before sunrise, tie a pale blue apron around her waist, and start cooking while the early light slid across the hardwood floors of her quiet kitchen. By noon the house would smell like roasted chicken, warm butter, and the lemon glaze. She always brushed carefully over the cake cooling beside the window. She never rushed. She never complained. Traditions, Margaret believed, were not loud things. They were quiet habits repeated year after year until they became the shape of a family. That morning had been no different. The table had been set with the good china her husband once insisted they save only for holidays. The silverware had been polished until it caught the afternoon sunlight. Even the flowers had come from the same small shop 2 blocks away, where the owner still remembered Margaret's husband by name. By 4 o'clock the house was ready. Margaret stood for a moment in the doorway of the dining room and looked at the table the way someone might look at an old photograph. For plates, for glasses, for cloth napkins folded neatly beside them. Her son Daniel arrived first, walking in with the distracted energy of a man who always seemed halfway through another thought. Behind him came Ashley Whitmore, his wife of 11 years, stepping through the front door with confident ease, carrying a store-bought pie and the faint perfume Margaret could never quite name. Their daughter Lily, 10 years old and growing taller every month, ran straight to Margaret for a quick hug before disappearing toward the living room. For the first half hour, everything felt almost normal. Coats were hung. The pie was placed on the kitchen counter. Daniel asked about the garden. Ashley commented politely on the flowers in the dining room centerpiece. Margaret moved quietly between the stove and the table, placing dishes down one by one until the table filled with food that had taken most of the day to prepare. When everyone finally sat down, Margaret allowed herself a small, private breath of relief. For a moment the room looked exactly the way she had imagined it earlier that morning. Plates clinked softly. Lily reached for the mashed potatoes. Daniel poured iced tea into the glasses. Then Ashley stood up. It happened so naturally that no one questioned it at first. She picked up her wine glass, tapped it gently with a fork, and waited for the small sound to gather everyone's attention. Margaret noticed the way Ashley stood at the head of the table, slightly angled toward the others, her shoulders relaxed, her smile calm and certain. "I just wanted to say something before we start," Ashley said lightly. Daniel looked up at her. Lily paused with her fork halfway to her plate. Margaret sat perfectly still, her hands folded quietly in her lap. Ashley lifted her glass a little higher. "Being a mother isn't easy," she continued, her voice warm and confident. "It's a full-time job. The sleepless nights, the school projects, the soccer games, the constant responsibility. Sometimes it feels like the hardest work in the world." Margaret watched her carefully, the way someone studies a detail they are not sure they understand yet. Ashley's smile widened slightly as she finished her thought. "So tonight," she said, raising the glass just a little higher, "I'd like to make a toast to the real mom in this family." For a second the room stayed quiet, the kind of silence that slips in before anyone has decided how to react. Ashley clinked her glass lightly against Daniel's, still smiling, still standing confidently beside Margaret's chair, as if nothing about the moment was unusual at all. Margaret did not move. She simply watched the candlelight flicker across the polished silverware and listened to the faint ticking of the kitchen clock on the wall behind them, realizing that something small had just shifted inside the room, something quiet but permanent, like the first crack forming in glass. Margaret Whitmore did not correct Ashley, and she did not lower her eyes. She simply lifted her own glass a few inches from the table and gave a small polite nod, the same quiet gesture she had used for decades, whenever guests thanked her for dinner. Then she took a sip of water and placed the glass carefully back beside her plate. The room slowly resumed its movement. Daniel cleared his throat and reached for the serving spoon. Lily asked for more mashed potatoes. Ashley sat down again with the calm confidence of someone who believed she had said something completely natural. For the next several minutes the sounds of dinner returned in gentle fragments, forks touching plates, ice shifting inside tall glasses, the low hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Margaret served food the same way she always had. She passed the roasted chicken to Daniel, slid the bowl of green beans toward Lily, and asked if anyone wanted more gravy. Her voice stayed soft and steady, never rising, never showing the smallest hint that anything unusual had happened. Anyone watching from the outside might have believed it was simply another quiet holiday meal inside a suburban American home. But Margaret noticed details. She had always been good at noticing details. She noticed the way Ashley leaned slightly forward in her chair as she spoke, as if she were naturally taking the center of the table. She noticed how Daniel laughed a little too quickly at Ashley's stories, nodding along with whatever she said. She noticed how Lily looked from one adult to another, sensing something subtle in the air, even if she could not explain it. Margaret kept her posture straight, her hands calm as she cut a small piece of chicken on her plate. The candle flames flickered gently between the glasses, reflecting in the polished silverware. For a moment her thoughts drifted backward through the years inside that same dining room. She remembered a younger Daniel sitting in the same chair when his feet did not yet reach the floor, swinging his legs while he talked about baseball practice. She remembered her husband carving the turkey every Thanksgiving with the careful patience of a man who believed family meals mattered. Those memories had always lived quietly inside the walls of the house, layered over each other like old photographs in a box. Margaret had never imagined they could be replaced so easily by something else. Ashley continued talking, describing Lily's school projects and the busy schedule of a modern mother. Her voice filled the room easily, confident and practiced. Daniel listened with the polite attention of a husband who had heard these stories before. Margaret finished her bite of chicken and placed her fork down beside the plate. Across the table, Ashley laughed again, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Sometimes I think mothers today have it harder than ever," she said lightly, lifting her glass again for a casual sip of wine. Daniel nodded in agreement. Lily asked if she could have another dinner roll. Margaret passed the basket to her granddaughter and offered a gentle smile. From the outside, everything still looked peaceful. But inside Margaret, a quiet realization had begun to settle, slow and clear like dust falling in a beam of afternoon light. The dinner she had spent all day preparing was still warm on the table. The house still belonged to her. The traditions still lived in the small, careful details she had preserved for decades. And yet something about the room had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Margaret understood then that moments like this did not arrive suddenly. They grew slowly over time, hidden inside small comments, subtle gestures, and quiet assumptions that no one bothered to question. She folded her napkin gently beside her plate and listened as Ashley continued talking about the responsibilities of motherhood, the words floating comfortably through a house that Margaret had once believed would always remember who built it. Margaret Whitmore cleared the dinner plates slowly, the way she had done thousands of times before, carrying them from the dining room to the kitchen one at a time, while the voices behind her continued in an easy rhythm. The sink filled with warm water and soap bubbles as she rinsed each dish carefully before placing it into the dishwasher. Through the open doorway, she could still hear Ashley speaking, her voice confident and steady as she described Lily's upcoming school recital and the endless responsibilities that came with raising a child in a busy modern world. Daniel responded occasionally with quiet agreement, the soft murmur of his voice blending into the background of the house that had once been filled with very different sounds. Margaret dried her hands on a clean towel and stood for a moment at the kitchen counter, looking through the small window above the sink. Outside, the evening light had begun to fade over Maple Ridge Drive. The maple trees along the sidewalk swayed gently in the spring breeze, and a neighbor walked past with a golden retriever on a long blue leash. Everything outside looked calm and ordinary, the same quiet neighborhood Margaret had known for more than 40 years. Behind her, the laughter from the dining room rose again as Ashley told another story. Margaret returned to the table carrying a fresh pot of coffee and 4 small dessert plates. The lemon cake she had baked that morning rested neatly on the serving stand, its pale yellow glaze shining softly under the dining room light. Lily's eyes brightened when she saw it. Daniel smiled politely. Ashley leaned back slightly in her chair, as if the evening were unfolding exactly as she expected. Margaret cut the cake into even slices and placed one in front of each person. Her movements remained steady and careful, but her mind continued replaying the small moment that had started the evening's strange shift. She had hosted hundreds of dinners in that room. She had watched birthdays, anniversaries, and holiday gatherings unfold around that same table. Yet tonight something had felt subtly different from the beginning, as if the balance of the room had quietly tilted while no one was paying attention. Ashley took the first bite of cake and nodded with approval. "This is really good," she said casually. "Lily loves lemon desserts." Margaret gave a small smile. "It is the same recipe I used when Daniel was her age," she replied gently. Daniel looked down at his plate for a moment, perhaps remembering something from long ago, though he did not say it aloud. Ashley reached for her wine glass again and continued talking about the busy schedules of young families, the costs of after-school activities, and the constant pressure parents face today. Margaret listened without interrupting. The words flowed easily from Ashley, filling the dining room with a sense of confident authority that had slowly grown over the past several years. Margaret noticed another small detail then, something she had not fully recognized before. Ashley spoke about the future of the family as if she were already standing at the center of it, as if the house itself were simply another stage where her voice belonged naturally. Daniel nodded along with her thoughts. Lily quietly finished her slice of cake. Margaret folded her napkin beside her plate and looked around the room once more, at the polished wooden table, the framed photographs on the far wall, and the soft glow of the overhead light that had hung there since the early 1980s. Every object in that room carried a memory, a history that had begun long before Ashley ever stepped through the front door. Margaret understood something clearly in that moment. The evening had not revealed a sudden change. It had only uncovered something that had been growing slowly for years, hidden in small comments, subtle assumptions, and quiet expectations about who truly held the place at the center of the family table. After dessert, the table slowly emptied and the evening settled into a quieter rhythm, the kind that usually followed a long family meal. Lily asked if she could watch a movie in the living room, and Daniel turned on the television while Ashley scrolled through her phone for a moment before setting it down beside her glass. Margaret remained in the dining room collecting plates again, her movements calm and deliberate, as if the routine itself carried a kind of quiet comfort. She carried the dishes to the kitchen and began rinsing them under warm water while the sound of the television drifted softly from the next room. The house had always felt larger at night, especially after dinner when the bright energy of the day faded into slower moments. Margaret had always liked that part of the evening. It gave her time to think. Tonight her thoughts moved carefully through the events of the day, returning again and again to the small moment when Ashley had lifted her glass at the center of the table. It had not been loud or dramatic. No one had argued. No one had protested. Yet the meaning of it had been clear in a way that did not require explanation. Margaret dried another plate and placed it neatly into the cabinet. For years she had believed that time itself would keep the balance of the family steady. She believed that respect naturally followed age, that traditions naturally remained in the hands of the person who built them. But standing there in the quiet kitchen, she realized how easily those assumptions could shift. Voices from the living room floated down the hallway again. Ashley was talking about a school event Lily would attend next month, describing it with the confident tone of someone who expected every detail of the future to move according to her plans. Daniel listened and agreed as he always did, occasionally adding a small comment or question. Margaret finished washing the last plate and turned off the water. She dried her hands slowly on the kitchen towel and stood still for a moment, listening. The words from the living room reached her clearly now. Ashley mentioned how much work it took to raise a child properly. She talked about schedules, responsibilities, and sacrifices. Then her voice lowered slightly, but the kitchen doorway carried the sound easily. "Honestly," Ashley said, "this house is really too much for Margaret now. It is a lot for one person to manage." Daniel did not answer immediately. The pause that followed was short but noticeable. Margaret did not move. She remained beside the counter, the folded towel resting quietly in her hands. Ashley continued speaking, her voice calm and practical. She mentioned the idea of smaller homes, communities designed for older residents, places where life might be easier for someone in their 70s. The words were not cruel. They were not angry. In fact, they sounded almost thoughtful, as if she were discussing something sensible and responsible. That was what made them feel heavier than they appeared. Margaret looked slowly around the kitchen she had organized the same way for nearly 40 years. The wooden cabinets, the small clock above the doorway, the row of family photographs on the shelf beside the refrigerator. Each object had remained exactly where she had placed it decades earlier. Yet suddenly the room felt slightly different, as if someone else had already begun imagining a future where she no longer belonged at the center of it. Margaret folded the towel once more and placed it carefully beside the sink. Then she walked toward the hallway leading to the living room, her footsteps light against the floor, her expression calm and unreadable as the quiet realization settled fully into place. Margaret Whitmore paused briefly in the hallway before entering the living room, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood that small moments often revealed more when they were allowed to continue naturally. The television screen cast a soft blue light across the room, reflecting against the glass frame of an old family photograph on the mantel. Daniel sat on the couch beside Lily, who was curled up with a blanket as the opening scenes of a movie played quietly. Ashley sat in the armchair near the window, leaning slightly forward with the relaxed posture of someone who already felt completely at home in the space. When Margaret stepped into the room, Ashley looked up with a quick smile that appeared perfectly polite. "Dinner was wonderful," she said lightly, as if the evening had unfolded exactly as expected. Margaret nodded once in return. "I am glad you enjoyed it," she replied gently before taking a seat in the wooden chair beside the fireplace. For a few minutes no one said very much. The sound of the movie filled the background while Lily watched the screen with quiet attention. Daniel leaned back against the couch cushions, occasionally glancing at his phone before setting it down again. Ashley rested one arm along the side of the chair, her fingers loosely holding her glass. The conversation that followed seemed casual at first. Ashley began talking again about Lily's school schedule, mentioning upcoming events, projects, and activities that would keep the family busy over the next few months. Margaret listened quietly, her expression calm. Then Ashley shifted the conversation in a way that sounded almost thoughtful. "Lily's school is only 15 minutes from our house," she said, speaking as if she were simply considering practical details. "But from here it takes almost 30 minutes with traffic." Daniel nodded slowly. "That is true," he admitted. Ashley tilted her head slightly, as though the idea had only just occurred to her. "Sometimes I think it might make more sense for everyone if things were arranged differently," she continued. Her tone remained soft and reasonable, the way someone might discuss a simple household change. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and watched the faint glow of the television light moving across the room. Ashley spoke again after a short pause. "A house like this is a lot to manage," she said gently. "It is big, it is old, and it probably requires more work every year." Daniel did not immediately respond, but his silence carried its own meaning. Ashley continued with the same calm confidence she had shown at the dinner table earlier that evening. She spoke about smaller homes, about convenience, about how many people in their 70s preferred communities designed for easier living. Her words never sounded harsh. In fact, they sounded almost helpful, as if she were offering a sensible solution to a quiet problem. Margaret noticed something important then. Ashley was not asking a question. She was describing a future she had already imagined. The living room remained peaceful, the television continuing its soft dialogue while Lily watched the screen. Daniel shifted slightly on the couch, still saying nothing. Margaret looked slowly around the room she had arranged decades earlier, at the same bookshelf, the same curtains, the same polished wooden floor that had once echoed with the sound of a young boy running through the house. The silence settled gently between the adults as Ashley finished her thought with a light smile. "Of course," she added calmly. "It would just be something to think about." Margaret nodded once, the same quiet gesture she had used earlier at the table. But inside her mind the evening had already changed shape. What Ashley had said was not merely a suggestion. It was the first clear outline of a plan that had likely been forming long before this dinner ever began. Margaret Whitmore remained seated in the wooden chair beside the fireplace long after Ashley finished speaking, her hands still folded gently in her lap, while the television light flickered softly across the room. The quiet hum of the movie continued as Lily watched the screen with the full attention only a 10-year-old could give to a story. Daniel leaned forward slightly with his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the carpet for a moment as if he were considering the practical side of what Ashley had just said. Margaret noticed that expression immediately. She had seen it many times during the years when Daniel was growing up. It was the look he made whenever he was thinking through a problem, weighing one idea against another before speaking. Ashley sat comfortably in the armchair, one leg crossed over the other, her posture relaxed and certain. She had already said what she intended to say. Now she waited for the idea to settle naturally into the room. Margaret understood that kind of patience. Some people pushed their opinions loudly. Others simply placed them quietly into a conversation and allowed time to do the rest. After a few moments, Daniel spoke. His voice was calm, careful, the way someone speaks when trying to sound reasonable. It is just something to think about, he said slowly. A house this size probably does require a lot of upkeep. Margaret nodded once, not because she agreed, but because she recognized the direction the conversation was moving. For decades, she had managed every corner of the house herself. The roof had been replaced once. The kitchen had been remodeled 15 years earlier. The garden still bloomed each spring because Margaret woke early every Saturday morning to care for it. None of those things felt difficult to her. They felt like ordinary parts of the life she had built inside those walls. Ashley leaned forward slightly as if encouraged by Daniel's words. Exactly, she replied in a thoughtful tone. It is not about changing everything immediately. It is just about planning ahead. Margaret listened without interrupting. Her gaze moved slowly across the living room again, pausing briefly on the photograph above the fireplace. It showed Daniel at the age of 8 standing beside his father in the backyard, both of them smiling while holding a small red baseball glove between them. The photograph had been taken almost 37 years earlier. Ashley continued speaking gently about convenience and future possibilities, describing smaller houses, quieter neighborhoods, places where older residents could live comfortably without worrying about maintenance or long hallways. The words sounded helpful. They sounded responsible. Yet Margaret could hear something else beneath them. Ashley was not describing Margaret's life. She was describing a version of the future where Margaret no longer occupied the center of the home she had created. Daniel shifted again on the couch and glanced briefly toward his mother. We are not saying anything needs to happen right away, he added carefully. Just that it might be worth thinking about eventually. Margaret met his eyes for a moment and gave the same small, polite smile she had used all evening. She understood now that this dinner had not been only a holiday gathering. It had been a quiet introduction to an idea that had likely been discussed many times before inside another house across town. Margaret did not argue. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she stood slowly from the chair beside the fireplace and walked toward the hallway leading back to the kitchen. The soft light from the living room faded behind her as she stepped into the quiet space she knew better than anyone else. For the first time that evening, Margaret allowed herself to consider a different thought. If Ashley had been planning the future of this house, then perhaps it was time for Margaret to begin planning something as well. Margaret Whitmore stood alone in the kitchen for several quiet minutes after leaving the living room, the soft voices from the television drifting faintly down the hallway while the house slowly settled into its familiar nighttime calm. She turned on the small light above the sink and looked out the window at the darkened street where the maple trees moved gently in the cool spring air. For decades, this kitchen had been the center of her routine. Every cabinet, every drawer, every small detail had been placed exactly where she wanted it. She could reach for a measuring spoon without looking. She could find a recipe card in the drawer beside the refrigerator with her eyes closed. The house was not simply a place where she lived. It was a record of every year she had spent building a family life that once felt permanent. Margaret placed both hands lightly on the counter and allowed the evening's conversation to replay quietly in her mind. Ashley's words had been calm, practical, even polite. That was what made them so clear. The plan had not been sudden. It had been forming slowly, shaped by conversations that Margaret had not been present to hear. The house was too large. It required too much maintenance. A smaller place might be easier. The words sounded like concern, but Margaret understood their true meaning now. They were preparing for a future where she would step aside. After a few moments, she walked toward the small desk tucked into the corner of the kitchen. The desk had once belonged to her husband, who used it every evening to sort bills and letters after dinner. The wooden surface still carried faint marks from years of use, but everything remained organized exactly as Margaret had kept it since he passed away 8 years earlier. She opened the top drawer and removed a thin folder that had been resting there for a very long time. Inside were several documents neatly arranged in clear plastic sleeves. Margaret had not looked at them in months, but she knew every page by memory. Her husband had insisted on preparing everything carefully before his health declined. He believed that planning ahead protected the family from confusion later. At the time, Margaret had listened patiently while the lawyer explained each detail, though she had never imagined the documents would matter quite this soon. She sat down in the chair beside the desk and opened the folder slowly, the pages reflecting the warm light above the counter. Outside the kitchen, the quiet sound of the television continued while Lily laughed softly at something happening on the screen. Daniel's voice answered her with a gentle comment. Ashley spoke again after a moment, her tone light and relaxed. The evening in the living room carried on as if nothing important had happened at all. Margaret turned one page, then another, her eyes moving carefully across the lines she already knew. The arrangement had been simple and deliberate. The house on Maple Ridge Drive was not something that could be sold casually or transferred without thought. Her husband had been very clear about that. Margaret closed the folder again and rested her hand on top of it for a moment. She did not feel angry. She did not feel hurt in the way someone might expect. What she felt instead was a quiet sense of clarity, the kind that arrives when a person finally understands the shape of a situation that has been slowly forming for years. Ashley had spent the evening outlining a future she believed would eventually happen. Margaret looked once more around the quiet kitchen before placing the folder carefully back inside the drawer. If Ashley believed the future of this house had already been decided, then she had misunderstood something very important about the woman who had spent 40 years protecting it. Margaret Whitmore remained in the kitchen for a few minutes longer, allowing the quiet certainty inside her mind to settle into place. The folder in the drawer had not surprised her. She had known its contents for years, but that night it felt different, as if the pages had quietly shifted from simple preparation into something far more relevant. She turned off the light above the desk and walked slowly back toward the living room, her footsteps calm and steady along the familiar hallway. When she entered the room again, Lily was laughing softly at something happening in the movie. Daniel sat beside her with one arm resting along the back of the couch, his attention divided between the screen and the phone in his hand. Ashley remained in the armchair near the window, the same relaxed posture she had held earlier in the evening. She glanced up as Margaret entered, offering another small smile that seemed perfectly polite. Margaret returned the gesture with a quiet nod before sitting again in the wooden chair beside the fireplace. For several minutes, she simply watched the television with the others, saying very little. The room felt peaceful on the surface, but Margaret could sense the subtle expectation beneath it. Ashley believed the conversation from earlier had already planted its seed. Daniel had not argued. The idea had been introduced gently. Now it would simply grow with time. Margaret folded her hands together and looked toward the photograph above the fireplace again, the one showing Daniel as a young boy standing proudly beside his father. Her husband had always believed in planning ahead. He used to say that the strongest decisions were the ones made quietly long before anyone else realized they were necessary. After a few minutes, Margaret spoke, her voice calm and steady. "Daniel," she said gently. He looked up from the couch. "Yes, Mom." Margaret met his eyes with the same quiet expression she had carried all evening. "Next week I will be meeting with Mr. Carter," she said. Daniel blinked once in mild surprise. "The lawyer?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "Your father worked with him for many years," she replied. Ashley shifted slightly in the armchair, the first small sign of curiosity crossing her face. "Is everything all right?" she asked in a careful tone. Margaret smiled softly. "Everything is perfectly fine," she said. "There are simply a few documents that need to be reviewed from time to time." Daniel nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with the explanation. Lily continued watching the movie without paying attention to the conversation. Ashley leaned back again in her chair, though the calm certainty she had carried earlier seemed slightly more cautious now. Margaret allowed the silence to return naturally. The television light flickered across the walls while the evening moved forward exactly as it had before. Yet something inside the room had shifted again, this time in a way Ashley could not fully see. Margaret did not explain the details of the folder in the kitchen drawer. She did not mention the careful arrangements her husband had made years earlier. She simply sat quietly beside the fireplace, her hands resting gently in her lap, while the house on Maple Ridge Drive remained exactly where it had always been. Ashley believed the future of the house would unfold slowly according to her expectations. Margaret understood that the truth was very different. The future had already been decided long ago, written clearly on a few quiet pages that waited patiently inside a drawer only 20 feet away. The evening ended quietly, the way most family gatherings eventually do. The movie finished, Lily stretched and rubbed her eyes, and Daniel stood up to collect their coats from the hallway. Ashley thanked Margaret again for dinner with the same calm politeness she had shown all night, though there was a thoughtful look in her eyes now, as if she were still considering the brief mention of the lawyer. Margaret walked them to the front door, the cool spring air slipping gently inside as Daniel opened it. Lily hugged her grandmother quickly before stepping onto the porch. Ashley followed with a careful smile and a soft goodbye. Daniel paused for a moment beside his mother. "Dinner was really nice, Mom," he said, his voice sincere in a quiet way. Margaret nodded once. "Drive safely," she replied. Then the door closed, and the house returned to its familiar silence. Margaret stood in the entryway for a moment, listening as the car started in the driveway and slowly rolled down Maple Ridge Drive. When the sound of the engine faded completely, she turned off the porch light and walked back through the house. The rooms were calm again, just as they had been before the dinner began. The dining table still held the faint scent of lemon from the cake. The chairs were pushed neatly into place. Margaret moved through the kitchen, rinsing the last 2 glasses that had been left beside the sink. When she finished, she dried them carefully and returned them to the cabinet. Then she walked once more to the small desk in the corner of the kitchen and opened the drawer. The folder was exactly where she had left it earlier that evening. Margaret placed it on the desk and opened it slowly, the pages reflecting the warm light above the counter. The arrangement her husband had made years ago was simple and very clear. The house on Maple Ridge Drive had been placed into a family trust long before his health began to fail. The trust did not belong to Daniel. It could not be sold without Margaret's consent. And when Margaret was gone one day, the house would pass directly to Lily. Her husband had insisted on that detail with quiet determination, believing that one day their granddaughter might need a place that would always belong to her. Margaret closed the folder again and rested her hand on it gently. Ashley had spent the evening imagining a future where the house would eventually shift into new hands, where practical decisions and careful suggestions would slowly guide Margaret out of the center of the life she had built. But the truth had already been written years earlier, sealed quietly inside these pages. Margaret returned the folder to the drawer and closed it with a soft click. She turned off the kitchen light and walked slowly through the living room toward the staircase. The photograph above the fireplace caught her attention one more time as she passed. The image of her husband and young Daniel standing together in the backyard on a bright summer afternoon many years ago. Margaret paused for a moment, studying the familiar picture with a calm expression. Her husband had understood something important about time and family. The strongest foundations were the ones prepared long before anyone thought they would be needed. Margaret continued up the staircase, the wooden steps creaking softly beneath her feet. Tomorrow she would call Mr. Carter and schedule the meeting she had mentioned earlier. Not because the plan needed to change, but because it was time to review it carefully. Some people believe the future arrived suddenly with bold decisions